Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we have further Russian advances in the Kursk direction as they secure their foothold recently gained northwest of Svetlikovo. The Russians have also managed to advance in the south of Toretsk. To the west of Selidova, the Russians have managed to advance in numerous areas in the northern flank of Kurakhove and in the southern flank of the settlement north of Velika Novosilka, and to the west of Velika Novosilka there's been several Russian advances. The Russians are advancing all across the southern section of the front line, and then there's positional fighting both in the Toretsk direction and in the Kursk region. Starting out in the north, the Russians have managed to advance further from Nizhny Klin and have secured some of the forest lines and farm areas here to the northwest of Svetlikovo, as the Russians slowly advance towards Svetlikovo itself, which is the gateway for the Russians towards Sucha, where the Russians will look to flank the Ukrainian supply lines going in and out of the outskirts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Considering the current situation, the Russians could benefit from launching small assault groups to different areas near Luknia and Lebedivka, here in between Sucha and Malaya Luknia. The objective of those would be to hit the supply lines of the Ukrainians and set up ambushes similar to what the Ukrainians did during the initial phases of the Kursk incursion. This could allow the Russians to hit the supply lines and weaken the Ukrainian forces in the north. Combined with FPV drones and reconnaissance drones, the Russians would be able to detect the Ukrainian units and hit their supply lines. In general, these recent advances here in the western parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion are critical for the Ukrainians to respond to, otherwise their situation in the northern parts of the incursion would become very difficult. Moving on to the Toretsk direction, the Russians have managed to recapture some of the positions they recently lost in the last month. With this recent advance, the Russians are pressuring the high ground under Ukrainian control, and they're looking to flank the fortified positions, which would open up the way for the rest of the fortified positions. However, I'm not sure what the game plan is for the Russians, considering the Ukrainians still hold on to the high ground just north of these locations. So what exactly is happening in details, there's no answer to that. There's also been a limited geolocated footage recently, relying heavily on reports from the ground, to which there's not a lot of information of the fighting actually taking place. Moving up to the Selidova direction, to the north of the settlements, the Russians have advanced south of Lysivka as they advance along the high ground south of the settlement. The Russians are slowly developing offensive operations towards this defensive line of the Ukrainians south of Pokrovsk, as Russians have also advanced west of Selidova to capture the majority of Shufte and moved along the railways towards the settlements of Vidroshenya, Shevchenko, and Novopustinka. To the south of this, Russians have also managed to gain a foothold within Pushkine, so the Russians are now developing new offensive operations here near Selidova, following the capture of Rurivka, Petrivka, Pustinka, Yurivka, Novosolexivka, and now moving on towards Shufte, capturing the majority of the settlement. To the south, the Russians have captured the fortified positions west of Beresky. With this, the Russians have full control over the fortified areas here near the northern flank of Kurakhove, and the next target for the Russians is Stary Terny, both from Sontsivka and from Beresky, while the pocket that has formed in between these two settlements will very quickly be closed, as there is no defensive positions the Ukrainians can rely on. They're simply located in the first lines, holding some sort of position there, with no significant fortifications, and this means that the Ukrainians will be unable to hold on to it and will likely withdraw to Stary Terny, where there are fortified positions, and then onwards towards Shevchenko and Deshne to the west and south of these locations. The Russians continue the developments of offensive operations north of Stary Terny, and to the south, the Russians have also managed to advance south of the river line towards Sukhyali and Selenivka, as the Russians continue developing the offensive operations in this direction as well. Heavy fighting continues in the direction of Velika Novosilka, where the Russians have captured the remaining parts of Rostolne, gaining full control over the settlement, with this geolocated footage confirming this. The Russians have also managed to advance to the south of these fortified positions towards Novye Kumar, and at the same time the Russians are flanking Makarivka from the west, capturing the remaining fortified positions west of the settlement. Taking a closer look at these advances, starting out near the river line, the Russians have managed to advance, capturing some forest lines and developing offensive operations towards Sokhyali and Selenivka. It seems that the Russians are now developing offensive operations to cut off additional supply lines towards the Uspenivka direction, creating a new pocket, potentially to envelop the entirety of Kurakhove by connecting the northern flank of Kurakhove from Berezki to the southern flank near Selenivka and Sokhyali, moving towards Ulekli. This would mean that the Russians would have to push through to gain control over Stary, cutting off the supply lines in the northern direction and gaining fire control over the roads here west of Kurakhove towards Dashne, and at the same time push towards Sokhyali and Selenivka here to the south, leaving only the road here west of Kurakhove out in and out of the settlement and in this entire pocket, connected with Kurakhove in the north and Henivka and Uspenivka in the south. This entire area of the Ukrainians would be left without supplies, as the Russians would operationally encircle the whole thing, based on operations advancing towards Selenivka, Sokhyali, and Stary in the northern and southern flanks. The Russian advances near Rostolne. With the full capture of the settlements, the Russians can now move on towards the fortified positions, gaining control of which would cut off the road here between Velikonovasilka and Bahatir. At the same time, the Russians are developing offensive operations near Novy Kumar, where the Russians will look to gain control over the fortified positions east and west and on the road itself, before moving on towards Novy Kumar, which is fairly undefended compared to the importance of the settlement, with the fortified positions surrounding it being the only fortified areas. Novy Kumar is also located near the flank of the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. If the Russians gain control over Novy Kumar, they can flank the fortified positions and attack them from their weak points, which will allow the Russians to develop offensive operations north of Velikonovasilka further, while at the same time the capture of the fortified positions west of Makarivka will allow the Russians to hit the supply line in and out of Makarivka, forcing the Ukrainians to withdraw with this operational encirclement or run out of supplies eventually. The Russians are also developing offensive operations here. With the capture of the fortified positions, they're moving on to the next fortified positions north by Storesheve. The Russians will slowly move along the Vremivsky Lech and the river line here near Vremivka, while at the same time closing the pocket south of Velikonovasilka, cutting off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces within that pocket as well. So generally, we can say the front line is simply pockets forming at a very slow rate, but with these operational encirclements one after another, it forces the Ukrainians to withdraw or to take heavy casualties. Which brings us to this article by the Associated Press, and it's a very interesting article. The headline states, "Desertion threatens to starve Ukraine's forces at a crucial time in its war with Russia." In it, the Associated Press talks with several soldiers who have abandoned the front line. The Associated Press spoke to 2 deserters, 3 lawyers, and a dozen Ukrainian officials and military commanders. Official and commanders spoke on condition of anonymity to divulge classified information, while one deserter did so because he feared prosecution. It is clear that now, frankly speaking, we have already squeezed the maximum out of our people, said an officer with the 72nd Brigade, who noted that desertion was one of the main reasons Ukraine lost the town of Volodar, and this is exactly why we haven't really seen the 72nd Brigade since the Battle of Volodar, because the 72nd Brigade, a lot of them were operationally encircled, of which some ended up being completely encircled, others were hit while on the move trying to withdraw from the settlement, and the remaining simply is not a strong enough fighting force. There's a very interesting fact here, which is that more than 100,000 soldiers have been charged under Ukraine's desertion laws since Russia invaded Ukraine, of which nearly half have gone AWOL in the last year alone, so I'm guessing from January 2024 until today. It's a staggering high number by any measure, as there was an estimated 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers engaged in combat before the mobilization drive began, and the actual number of deserters may be much higher. One lawmaker with knowledge of military matters estimated it could be as high as 200,000. 200,000 soldiers abandoning the front line is a very significant matter, as it is practically 200,000 killed in action. And that is a significant amount of soldiers, and it is beyond even what BBC News Russian estimates that the Russians have lost of soldiers. So this means just the people in Ukraine who have abandoned the front line surpass the amount of losses the Russians have had in this war. And that is even besides the amount of people the Ukrainians have lost due to them being killed in this war. So a very significant amount of Ukrainian losses simply from people abandoning the front line. And that is besides the point that when a group of soldiers abandons the front line without organizing it with others, then the others are in more danger. If a flank is suddenly left exposed, the Russians can take advantage of it, and they can encircle some Ukrainian forces, or they can flank them and ambush them. In either case, someone abandoning the front line is a very significant issue, and it happening on such a large scale creates terrible conditions for the Ukrainians fighting on the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.